Hello all, it's Jasper and welcome to the final video in my Geoguessr tip series for Canada. We will finish out east with the provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island or PEI, and Newfoundland. In the past, I've called these the Canadian Maritimes in my intro series, but I didn't realize that the name usually isn't used for Newfoundland. And as a Canadian, I am legitimately pretty embarrassed by that. Alas, this beautiful region, the Atlantic provinces, they're the only provinces in Canada that I have yet to visit. So we will start with the normal 3 teaser images, which sample some of what you'll see in this video. Some of the clues in these images just allow you to pinpoint the province or maybe the general region, but there is definitely a clue in this round that would allow me to get it within a few kilometers at least. To look on a map, we'll be covering everything in this orange region today. But when we look at the Google car coverage, we see that the most northern region of Labrador only has one road, which runs from Labrador City to Happy Valley Goose Bay. So in reality, we won't spend very long covering Labrador. The rest of the provinces in general have a lot of coverage everywhere. It's usually worth thinking separately about Newfoundland versus the Synoptic Maritimes. In New Brunswick, there's a lot of coverage on the western border with Maine in the US. And otherwise, the rule is that the Maritimes will always have a lot of coverage near the coast and generally less in the middle, even though that's where the best hedges will be. In Newfoundland, the best hedge is probably kind of close to Gander due to the way the Trans-Canada Highway curves around the north coast, and it only branches downwards occasionally. A huge amount of the more urban coverage in Newfoundland is near St. John's on the east coast, so that's usually the best guess around houses unless you see other clues. Now let's talk about the province-specific meta, because there's a lot of it for 4 provinces. I want to start with ways in which these provinces are all generally similar. And this is actually the end of me telling you to memorize area codes. I've put them on the slide, and you will definitely see them sometimes, but mostly out east, they don't actually write down the 3-digit area code before the other 7 digits in the phone number. Presumably, there just aren't that many telephone numbers to confuse. Now, there's a general feel to Atlantic provinces and their architecture. It's always a little bit hilly, and you have this particular architecture, so it's generally more colorful. It's less likely to be made out of brick than in Ontario or Quebec, although that's certainly possible. And we see here a few more examples of pretty nice houses in New Brunswick and Newfoundland. And it's not exactly unique architecture, but notice things like the driveways, vinyl siding. Typically they'll have mailboxes as opposed to joint boxes that you see more out west, I'd say. And it definitely has a certain Atlantic Ocean aesthetic, I would say. Now, poles out east are definitely a very important clue for region guessing. A tiny aside is that I did spot a few of these Ontario and US style cup insulator holders when I was making these slides, even though I didn't know they existed out there, and I still think it's a really good hint for guessing Ontario. But instead, let's look at a classic Eastern pole, and it's in the center, this very pale white, and for this one, it's even a little bent at the top. I see more of it being bent at the top. I see more of it being knotted throughout, that kind of thing. I've already mentioned that you can see similar poles in Quebec and Ontario. But I don't really see these poles in the US, and I still find them a great clue for the Maritimes. The other clue is that you will often see these poles with a little bit of tape of various colors right in the middle of the bottom telephone cable. Check part 5 on Quebec if you want to compare that to the tags that you'll see in Quebec and Ontario. They're very different. Just a little bit of tape right in the center. Now, next in my ugly collage collection, New Brunswick. New Brunswick is the only province in Canada that is officially bilingual. And so you'll often see both English and French on its signage. And that includes the classic Stop Arrête sign, which you'll almost never see anywhere else. We covered some other bilingual areas in Ontario close to Quebec, and there's definitely French communities throughout Canada, but they're fairly rare. And like I said, in New Brunswick, that's the official language. The important thing is that the French word for street comes before, and the English word comes after. And so when you see a sign like this, even though the word for avenue is the same in both English and French, we know that this is bilingual because we see both Cranston Avenue in English and Avenue Cranston in French. And so that bit before tells us that it's bilingual. Then next, New Brunswick often uses either a red little bollard at the beginning of its guardrails, especially on major highways, or a green bollard on the other side. And that's a good way of telling it apart from other provinces. We'll cover these metal guardrails more later on, so you can compare them directly. And then a few other things. The highway numbers are in an outline of the province, as you see here on this sign. New Brunswick changed from having front plates and no longer has front plates. They changed it in 2019. So you'll often see a bit of a mix in newer coverage. And then finally, this flag here in the top right, that's the Acadian flag for a historic French region. And it's pretty common in the northern half of New Brunswick. Now, just to show off what I mean, this is a map of New Brunswick by percentage with French as a first language. So unsurprisingly, most of the French is closer to Quebec. And also there's a lot of French near the capital city of Fredericton, since the government is bilingual. So if you see a sign that says only stop in New Brunswick and not stop arrête, I say guess somewhere closer to St. John on the south. Now finally, utility poles. New Brunswick is often cited along with British Columbia as the only other province that uses perpendicular transformers, so that this metal box here is perpendicular to the way that the power lines run. I do find that in New Brunswick it's a lot less reliable than in BC. So we see, for example, one power pole here where the transformer is parallel to the cables, and then in the same picture we see it perpendicular to the cables but pointing away from the road, and then over here perpendicular to the cables pointing towards the road. In BC, the transformers always point towards the road. Now, the other tip for New Brunswick is much harder to make out. And in cases where you have this single insulator atop a pole, it is only connected by one screw in New Brunswick. In other provinces, it's connected with 2 bolts instead. I'm not really going to point that out more, but you can practice it. You can start to see a difference, especially useful between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, I'd say. Now we go to Prince Edward Island, and there are 2 main things to remember for PEI. First and most important is the red soil color. Don't guess Brazil. Second is the poles, and not the utility poles, but we're just talking about signposts, things like that. So for one thing, most of PEI also uses bilingual street signs. And the other thing to note is the pole itself. While Canada is known for having a lot of wooden poles, PEI uses exclusively square poles with holes in them. And I basically never find the license plates in PEI easy to notice, but there are no front plates. So that's the only thing you need to know. Here's a good PEI round. So note the red soil color and small letters that if you're at least looking at this on a laptop, you should be able to see small letters coming just before the street name, even at a distance. And then I also like this because there's an Acadian flag over here on the left, and it proves it's not only in New Brunswick. The region of Acadia used to include PEI, New Brunswick, bits of Quebec, and maybe Nova Scotia, I think. But just pointing out that you do see these flags surprisingly often. Now, PEI can have a lot of weird specialty utility poles, and I don't have a good grasp on them because they're just too rare. But 2 things I will note. First, unlike New Brunswick, you will not find transformers perpendicular to the power lines. You will either find them parallel with the power lines or at a 45-degree angle, which can be hard to tell from a distance, and especially from a still image without context. But the point is you can find these in PEI at the 45-degree angle and in Nova Scotia. And then the other thing about the utility poles is you will find this number plate on them. And it's the best way maybe sometimes in those tricky rounds to distinguish PEI from Nova Scotia is just numbers written on a metal plate in this horizontal thing, and it's on almost all the utility poles. But speaking of Nova Scotia, the guardrails on major highways are often fronted with these long yellow bollards. So remember them in contrast to either the red or green bollards in New Brunswick, or 0 bollards in other eastern provinces. Then we have the Nova Scotia license plate, which is quite recognizable due to this blue ship that's in the middle. Nova Scotia highway markers, use a Nova Scotia flag on the top, if you can remember that, and then Nova Scotia utility poles. I find that the utility poles with 3 cables are often much narrower with the crossbeam here up top. And although that's not 100% reliable, if I see the long crossbeam up top, I'm much more likely to guess New Brunswick instead. And now is a good time to remind you, looking at poles like this, it's much more common in other provinces like Nova Scotia or Newfoundland that we will see when it's a metal pole, it's circular with no holes in it, as opposed to PEI again, which is square and holy. You can see both of these throughout Canada, so it's only useful if you're trying to tell the provinces apart and you're in a toss-up. But here we see a solid circular metal pole, and we also note that French has disappeared. It's only Poplar Street, and there's no rue in front of it. Finally, we get to Newfoundland and Labrador, the last province to join Canada in 1949. It's probably the easiest province to recognize of the bunch, but the hardest province to guess in. So the key to Newfoundland is recognizing the gray, rocky Canadian shield and distinguishing it from Ontario. But we also have this unique end of the road sign here, whereas most Canadian provinces just kind of have this bit in the middle. Here we have extra chevrons on either side. And we also have these hexagonal garbage bins where Newfoundlanders will put their garbage. And I've seen that rarely in places like New Brunswick, but it's a good clue. I find Newfoundland plates very nondescript. They're only on the back, and they're just here for having everything in here. Now, here's a sample of Newfoundland. The rocky sides, like over here, tell it apart from other Maritimes for the most part, and Northern Ontario wouldn't use a metal guardrail like this. Northern Ontario, if we remember, uses these wooden posts with metal wiring, and you can see that in part 4 of the series. But to speak more of guardrails, there's a lot more to be said of them, and they're crucial for telling apart difficult rounds out east. They're less useful for PEI, I'd say, which is usually just somewhere in between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and you tell it for different reasons. Again, big hat tip to Unassumed in their Google Doc in the comments, once again, if you want to check it out. Newfoundland has quite a distinctive wooden post that hold up the guardrails. So they end with this little pyramid point on top. And here I'll go back so that you can see a bit more of these pyramid points on the right side. But then I'll lose what I was trying to say. Anyway, there's pyramid points here, whereas for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they have an extra wooden piece built in. So there's one wooden block that goes down to the ground and another wooden block that attaches to the guardrail itself. The difference, which I'll try to show later in a better image, is that in Nova Scotia, that second wooden block that attaches to the guardrail is longer and it pokes out beneath the metal itself. So you can just see there's some wood beneath the metal in Nova Scotia and nothing poking out in New Brunswick. You will also see some slanted beams in addition to the double wooden poles, and especially in Nova Scotia. And so that's one slanted beam that's both going into the ground and attached directly to the pole. Here's a little sample round. We see that there's 2 wooden posts on the side, so one attached to the metal pole, and we do see some of that wood poking out beneath the metal. So we know that in this round, we're in Nova Scotia. Next up, geography. And I've turned on terrain to give a sense of the hills that we see in all of the Maritimes. And that's generally the problem here, is that the Maritimes look very similar. It's mostly hilly, and it's more forestry country than farming country, as a rule. So just for example, here we see some of the hills around the river valley in Fredericton. And in comparison, this region near Bathurst out in eastern New Brunswick is a bit flatter. But the other problem with the Maritimes is that the trees are generally so thick and close together, I often can't tell how flat it is at a distance. One thing I'll say is that when I see particularly tall hills in Nova Scotia, I often like to guess this spot here, kind of in the center but further north on the main island bit. The major exception to this geography, though, is PEI, which is dominated by kind of farming acreages, and even though it's still generally pretty hilly, you just see fewer trees. Don't get me wrong, there are also farms in New Brunswick and especially Nova Scotia, and you have to be careful not to confuse them with Ontario or Quebec on occasion. but trees upon trees are more the rule there. And speaking of PEI, the island acts as a bit of a red bullseye around which to remember your soil colors. So you will definitely also see red-tinged soil on northern parts of Nova Scotia or the southeastern bits of New Brunswick. And similarly, I tend to see dark brown soils in parts of northeastern New Brunswick, with varieties of gray elsewhere, especially kind of light colored in some parts of western New Brunswick, in my experience. And now, I actually feel like I'm pretty good at my guesses in Atlantic Canada, but I won't lie that rural Newfoundland is a big challenge. There just isn't that much rhyme or reason to what you'll see there. And just when I think I've mastered some trick about bigger mountains out west or fewer trees up north, a random round on the southern peninsula here will trip me up completely, and that'll happen to you too. But the one route that is worth mastering, I'd say, is this Highway 430 that goes way up in the northern peninsula. There are always a lot fewer trees, and they're very short trees, and there are fewer the further and further you go north. And the ocean being always directly to your west, I do find that getting that highway correct is possible and useful because it's so far away from the rest of the island. Next, we're on to city meta. I don't know how other people feel about my city meta rounds. I'm assuming this video is going to be pretty long already, but I often think it's some of the best stuff on this channel. And these are the major cities in Atlantic Canada, even though most of them would be very small by international standards. We'll go through them from west to east, and then at the end, I'll pop in a few honorable mentions that have particularly easy meta clues. And starting off with the first of the big three cities in New Brunswick, which is Fredericton. The one thing that I remember for Fredericton is blue. As you might have noticed on my cities map, almost all of the fire hydrants in Atlantic Canada have a red body, but Fredericton's almost always have these blue nozzles, and that's a pretty rare combination, red and blue, in North America generally. And the other part of blue Fredericton is the street signs. There's blue street signs, bilingual, in the newer coverage since 2015, because it's the capital city, and, they want to add the French, I guess, but most of New Brunswick, most of Canada doesn't use blue signs. So blue is usually a better one to remember than green is usually the default. But let's actually jump to St. John here just to compare. In contrast, St. John is a bit of everything. The signposts are usually green and usually bilingual. The red fire hydrants can have all kinds of markers next to them, I've seen. So here's an example of a red hydrant with this red circle on a pole next to it. You see markers, you see no markers. But the other thing I wanted to note is these odd metal joinders atop this pole. These show up in quite a few maritime cities. I don't have a full list. They look a bit like Quebec, which often does this, but they're a lot shorter. Quebec's metal insulator connectors are often a lot longer, and you'll see them both in rural Quebec and in urban Quebec as well. And so, again with St. John, there are two ways that I recognize St. John, because most of the other meta isn't reliable. It's hilly and on the ocean, which isn't really true of other cities in New Brunswick. And a lot of the signposts are so rusted that they look brown, which is just kind of interesting. You can see it on some of the old images too if you go back. But now we'll compare that to Moncton. And Moncton can have a wild mix of street signs. They're made to confuse you with other cities, I suppose. But the main things to remember is that it's flatter than the other major cities in New Brunswick. There's more French generally than those cities. And so you maybe should only confuse it with smaller cities in northern New Brunswick or along the east coast. But finally, it has these orange poles next to the red fire hydrants. I call these Winnipeg hydrants and store Moncton in the same part of my memory as Winnipeg. They kind of look similar, even though the two cities don't look anything alike. Now let's leave New Brunswick for PEI and talk about the somewhat tricky town that is Charlottetown. Charlottetown can be tricky because it doesn't always look red like the rest of the island. So I forget that PEI is an option. And also, when I see this image, I see a very boring fire hydrant that could be anywhere in North America, a boring license plate that could be anywhere too. Charlottetown's also just pretty small, so it's rare that you get these rounds and it's easy to forget. You can see bilingual signs here, which is good because I often mistake the aesthetics of Charlottetown more for Nova Scotia than New Brunswick. And you also see a lot of asymmetrical poles. So whether it's metal or wood, you'll see a pole that's just sticking out one side towards the road, and that often triggers my memory to look for Charlottetown. And don't forget the niche PEI meta. So we've got a diagonal box transformer up here. All the poles are square with the holes in them. And then we've got this characteristic numbered strip on the pole, which is really hard to see in this thing, but you can often find it. And you should almost always get it as long as you're not thrown off by the lack of red soil and forget to consider PEI. But now it's time for Nova Scotia and its capital of Halifax. This is easily the largest city in the group by a wide margin, and it's also the easiest city to get and guess. Longtime viewers should know why with this map, because the color of the star. And that's right, Halifax uses orange fire hydrants. It might be difficult at a distance to always tell them apart from red fire hydrants, but you should be able to with a little practice. Other things in the picture give it away too. We have the maritime city pole here, but we have apartment buildings over here that you can only really find in a city as big as Halifax. We have a blue blob in the center of this license plate, and that's for Nova Scotia. And if I allowed you to zoom a bit to the right, pan a bit to the right, you would see this easy to recognize bus. It says Halifax on it pretty prominently. I'll show you that there's the same pattern on the bus stops in Halifax as well. But again, the only thing you really need for Halifax is the orange fire hydrant. And the only city that also uses similar fire hydrants is Portland, Oregon. Now, I would forgive you for confusing Portland for Halifax, actually. If you're newer to Geoguessr, they're both kind of coastal cities, but realistically, you should be able to tell the two apart. And other cities in Nova Scotia can be much more difficult, however. We'll just look at Sydney, that's on Cape Breton Island right now, out east. And this is the first city on the list that I really can't guarantee you good metaphor. Sydney is a chameleon taking on the shape of other cities. Actually, come to think of it, that was a good metaphor. Take this round. We've got a Winnipeg kind of style fire hydrant. So it looks a bit like Moncton. And it's got this solid round pole too. The English only road sign doesn't work. So maybe you would guess another city in Nova Scotia. But then in this shot, we have a square post with holes in it. And we have a basic red and white fire hydrant there. Even a bit of red tinged soil, I'd say. So I might easily guess Charlottetown here. In the end, I think Sydney is a good example of a general rule in Canada. The further north you go and the further away from a province's capital city, the more likely you are to see signs that the city is just a bit poorer. So you'll see patchwork roads where potholes get repaired instead of a new road put in. You'll see a sidewalk on only one side of the road. Not only are the street lights attached to the wooden poles, which is pretty common out east, but is generally a sign. In newer neighborhoods or very rich cities, the streetlights are more likely to have their own pole, but also we see the stop signs are attached directly to the wooden poles. So it's just that sort of thing that might push me towards Sydney or, towns in that neighborhood more than towards Charlottetown. But now that I'm done pooping on Sydney's economy since the steel industry left, let's finish with St. John's, Newfoundland. Note that St. John's and St. John are totally different cities, and you only confuse them if you're a total idiot. It's very easy. Come on, folks. But St. John's itself is really easy to recognize when they use their yellow fire hydrants. So all of these hydrants have a post next to them with a diamond symbol halfway up. Not always this symbol, but some kind of diamond on the post. And as a side note, I'm just not talking about garbage bins for any of these cities. Today, they're all generic. I've never found them useful unless, of course, you're actually close enough you can just read the town name on them. But it's a very rainy and cloudy city. And near downtown, the houses are very colorful sometimes. You can get that elsewhere, but that's just very Newfoundland. And it's easily the largest city in Newfoundland, so usually a good one to guess. But I didn't actually realize how reliable the yellow hydrants were until I made the video. The problem is that there's a lot of well-populated suburbs and other towns directly in the St. John's area that'll confuse you. So this is Mount Pearl, which to non-Canadians playing Geoguessr, it's going to be exactly the same as guessing St. John's. They're right next to each other. But here you see a red fire hydrant, and again we have the large metal pole and it's got a little diamond on it. So the problem is that having the big red poles, even with the diamond pole next to it, that's very common in Newfoundland. They love their cities and towns will often have big red poles next to red fire hydrants. And so just to kind of talk about that, let's work our way backwards to cover some of the very obvious meta that are in other cities on the island. So we've covered the hydrants on Mount Pearl and nearby towns, but if you see diamonds on a stick, probably guess near St. John's. Gander actually looks a bit like Winnipeg, maybe. It's got white street signs, and it's got red hydrants, but with this yellow post on them. But this yellow post is actually a bit more like what you see in Western Quebec, not like the orange pole that sticks up in Winnipeg. And again, Gander doesn't look anything like Winnipeg, so that helps. But probably the most useful and unique is Corner Brook. They number every single fire hydrant with a giant red sign that's visible from a mile off. It's definitely worth remembering the Corner Brook fire hydrant number meta, in my opinion. And then picking some random smallish towns with distinctive fire hydrants. Yarmouth is another rare example of yellow hydrants. Note that sometimes they've got this freckled green pattern on the top. Amherst also has yellow hydrants, and they have this unique yellow on red hydrant post that kind of reminds me of Quebec fire hydrant posts. And then Edmundston is very close to Quebec, so in my mind, they have Quebec-style red on white fire hydrant posts, but they have yellow hydrants because Quebec doesn't have any yellow hydrants as far as I know. So kind of memory trick, close to Quebec, but not quite Quebec, Edmundston. Okay, once again, I think most of my rural meta tips get consumed during the sections on either the province meta or the geography, but I'll throw one out for Newfoundland. There's a very specific style of insulator that's more common in eastern Newfoundland. So although I don't know the exact boundaries, the point is that the top circle is larger than the bottom circle. And so that's more likely to be in this little red area, even in the rural areas of this part of the province. So compare that to insulators in the rest of Atlantic Canada, which I got this one from out west in Newfoundland. They typically look like this. So they'll have kind of a cone with the main big circle, one big circle on the bottom. The point is that they definitely don't have a larger circle on top of a smaller circle. It's a fine thing, but it can get you a good guess in eastern Newfoundland. And then it's important to tell apart the island of Newfoundland with the northern region of Labrador. So remember that there's only one road, and it's all done at one time. So it was done in November, so you're either going to get trees with no leaves, or you're even going to get snow sometimes a bit further out east. And then it mostly is done with clear skies, whereas most of Newfoundland is usually cloudy. As a rule, and it's Generation 4, this coverage too. So that's the other big thing. So as a general rule, Newfoundland itself won't have snow. It will have cloudy skies, and it mostly isn't Gen 4. It's either Gen 2 or Gen 3. And so if you see all of those things, and you're feeling risky, go up ahead and guess up Labrador. But you do get this Newfoundland and Labrador meta clues, and so it's not even that risky. It can be a great guess if you can pull it off. Oh, and here's an arrow just to make sure you know that that's the picture for it. And otherwise, just remember your soil colors, your general geography, the degree of speaking French, and that also correlates with how many Acadian flags you're going to see. Fortunately, the Atlantic provinces are mostly smaller, so if you can get the province correct, you can usually pull off some good points. That brings us back to our teaser rounds that we saw at the start of the video. Hopefully you look at this now and know immediately where you are. The first thing to note is the soil color, making this PEI or maybe New Brunswick or Nova Scotia right next to PEI. It's really hard to see, but that transformer up ahead, which looks perpendicular, is actually a bit angled. But let's agree that that meta isn't as consistent in the Atlantic provinces. On our right, we see a street sign with both English and French, which rules out Nova Scotia. And we see a square whole pole for that street sign, which suggests not New Brunswick. And this very red soil is probably not New Brunswick anyway, in my opinion. And finally, a characteristic PEI metal plate with numbers on the pole. I'll blow that up a bit so you can see them all. But really, that was a lot of useless meta for around this red, this flat, and with this few trees. It's PEI. And what do we think about this round? So the first, I'll point out that there's a phone number here on this sign, which has no area code. It's only 7 letters long, 7 numbers long. And so that suggests strongly Atlantic Canada. But we can say New Brunswick confidently due to a number of clues. We have a perpendicular transformer up here. We have a front license plate, which you will only see in New Brunswick. Actually, PEI has a lot of tourists, so that's thrown me off before. But you will only generally see front plates in New Brunswick. And the other thing we see here is, of course, the provincial logo, so the provincial outline for the highway number. And we see a bilingual sign, North and Nord. And so judging by the generally flat landscape and fairly brown dirt here where people have walked on the side of the road, that puts us somewhere in the northeast, although there aren't amazing clues for that, but that's where we are. And then finally in this round, we have a single wooden post here that's holding up the guardrail, and it has this little pyramid point on the top. And we have this wide yellow sign with two chevrons on either side of it. And both of those clues, along with the many pine trees, the rocky sides of the road, and the cloudy skies, suggest Newfoundland. Finally, off to the right, we have a red hydrant, which I will deliberately not zoom in on to prove a point. Even at this distance, and maybe I would say even on your phone, you can probably see a giant red rectangle on top of the fire hydrant. And that's enough to know that this is the numbered fire hydrants around Corner Brook, Newfoundland. So you could probably get a 5K on NMPZ of this round. And with that, our Geoguessr Canada series is coming to a close. So like usual, I will provide links to the maps that we've covered in this series. You've got this everything map, and then as well as a handpicked map of all the cities we covered in this video. Practice them soon to just reinforce what we went through, especially some of the finer point things, which sometimes take a bit of playing with before you get them. And this is the final page. So it's impossible to put every tip and hint into a video series, partly because I don't know them all. But I hope you're watching. If you're watching this, you now feel a lot more comfortable with your understanding of where you are in Canada and how you can get these high Geoguessr scores there. I will probably take a break before I do another project like this, but I might come back soon with just some gameplay to show off some of these Canada tips and tricks in practice. Feel free to let me know what you thought of the format, what you'd like to see next, or anything else that might be on your mind. But until next time, don't get lost out there, and thank you.